And that was really exciting because I was painting in such a thick, heavy way, and then watching these thick brush strokes just like move across the canvas. It was very beautiful. Working on the Van Gogh film, it loosened me up a lot because you couldn't be particular about very small brush strokes. Your brush strokes were large, they were fat, they were thick and sloppy. And this frame, every frame that you created, all the shapes that came from that frame, they worked together as one. It was like weaving together much more.
Loading artist, audio inside. Loading artist, audio inside. Oh, it's ahtcast, it's ahtcast, it's ahtcast. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Listen by your easel, maybe you can grab a chair, or even take it with you like you ain't got no care. Loading artists, audio inside. Loading artists, audio inside. So sit back and relax and grab your headphones too. Adjust your volume, it's ahtcast. Philip J. Mellon welcomes you, so sit back, oh yeah, it's ahtcast. Loading artists, audio inside. Loading artists, audio inside.
Welcome to ahtcast, the Loving Vincent episode. Loving Vincent is a hand-painted film worked over a 5-year period, which initially was filmed with live actors. Then a call was made for painters to come and work on the film and paint renditions of the footage using various methods to create the effects of Vincent van Gogh's paintings set in motion. Some 5,000 painters from around the world applied to work on the project, and only 125 were selected. Kat Knutsen was one of them. In this episode, I talked with Kat, based in New Bedford, Massachusetts, about her experiences during her work on the film. Thanks for listening. So, Kat Knutsen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Thanks.
Yeah.
How did it come about that you were selected to work on Loving Vincent?
I saw one of those movies on Facebook, one of those little video, a little short video talking about the Loving Vincent project going on. And that was, I think, in either late 2015 or early 2016. And I remember right after I saw that, I was like, I need to be a part of this. This is what I do. I had already previously worked with animating with oil paints, and this was just right up my alley, and I knew I needed to be a part of this.
Right.
And so I then sent in, I went to the Loving Vincent website, and I found out they were still taking applications, people to send their portfolio in. So I sent that in, and I emailed them. I even made a painting in what I thought was a slight Van Gogh style of Van Gogh. And then I, sent that in, and I just, waited to hear back from them. And I didn't hear back for quite a while, probably a month, maybe 2 months. And then all of a sudden I got an email from the manager, Magdalena. She was in charge of selecting and bringing on the finalist. And I found out that I got accepted, and I was ecstatic. Right. And then that's how I became one of them. It was really exciting. There was a sense of, you need to do this. You're going to do this.
Yeah.
But then, so I put my, hat in the ring. But when I got that email and then talked to her, I was like, wow, this is really happening. Okay, here we go.
And then off to Poland, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's cool. How long were you there?
Oh, gosh. It was like most of May, June, July.
Wow.
And a little bit of August, like the first week and a half, I think, of August.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now you mentioned to me, you said you completed about how many paintings for it?
I probably was just under 80 paintings. Yeah, there was.
That's a lot.
There was a lot of paintings. There were a lot of moments where I messed up and I had to start over, but overall completed probably right under 80.
Wow. At what location did you work on the film?
I was in this little city called Gdansk. It's on the north part of Poland, right on the Baltic Sea. It was almost right. There were parts of it that were right on the water.
Yeah.
It's an old city. I can't remember what it used to be called. Right after the Germans were there, but it's Gdansk, Gdansk. It had lots of beautiful architecture. There were new parts of the old city that were rebuilt in the 40s and 50s, right after World War II happened. And then there were still some buildings that were, left as they were from right after World War II. It was really interesting seeing the new buildings next to those old buildings. But it was a beautiful city.
I just had to ask Kat if she painted any of Van Gogh's irises for the movie. So did you paint the irises at all?
I didn't paint the irises, no. I painted a flower very similar to the irises. I don't remember what that flower was called, but in the scene that I painted with Dr. Gachet, I painted those flowers.
Oh, cool. Yeah, just as a fan, I had to ask.
Yeah, I could understand. They were very beautiful. That painting had lots of variations of blue to manage. I had 2 large palettes, each palette containing, a dozen or 2 shades of blue independently that had to be managed as I was animating that scene, and parts of the blue were in those flowers.
Cool. Next, Kat describes what it was like to paint with Van Gogh's color palette and his technique. Difficult thing?
It was very difficult at first for me to acclimate to that, because I'm normally a thin, more of a wash painter.
Yeah.
I paint with oils. That's my dominant medium. But I normally paint with like glazing, or there's a little bit of scumbling, but it's not as thick. And whereas the consistency that I was painting with on the Van Gogh film was like that of more like toothpaste consistency.
Yeah.
And the more you got the hang of it, the more it felt like I was putting these very malleable, wet pieces of like Lego consistency, just kind of attaching them to the canvas. Whereas with painting, you kind of smear this like liquidous plasma-like consistency on the canvas. It was very heavy paint, and it never dried. We added medium to it. I can't remember the name of the medium, but it made it so that you would mix all of the palette at once, and it would be able to stay wet for days and days and days.
Oh, wow.
And workable. But it was a very thick consistency, which I'm not used to. I'm used to working a lot thinner.
Next is the topic of the brushstroke and keeping it all together.
There were some times where you would keep count of the brushstrokes inside parts of the frame.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever I was near the middle of working on the film, I would sometimes, after work, see if I could paint, but more so draw, because I wouldn't have paint with me. I would just have, like a pen or my sketch pad, and I would draw out by memory the painting based on the strokes. And sometimes I would keep track of the number of brush strokes in the frames, just because you would do it so repetitively that you would just know. Like, I still remember, I don't remember the exact strokes of how many went into the brim of Dr. Gachet, but I do remember that, like, on the side of his face, the way that they had us putting the shadow in, there was always, like, between 5 and 7 orange strokes for his shadow. It was like an orangey, a muted yellow-orange color that was part of his shadow. And there's always the same strokes there that just kept moving slightly at angle, but it was the same number almost every time. It ranged between 1 and 2. And for his, let's see, his hair was stubborn. It was annoying painting his hair. But that, more so, it was probably between 15 and 20 strokes of one of the darker colors for his hair. And I remember that one because that color was always pushed up against the blue that was right behind him. And you never wanted these colors to bleed into each other because they would make a brown with them being complements.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I could probably still do a sketch, a rough sketch, using the same strokes on the Dr. Gachet scene.
Yeah. Next, I asked Kat what a typical painting day was like.
You'd wake up. At the very beginning, I would start early in the day, like 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. There was a cafe in the same building that we were working in, so you would have lunch there sometimes. Or there was another cafe inside this little mall that was about 2 blocks from where we were working. We would go there in groups sometimes. So we'd eat lunch, and then we'd go back to work. And then based on the number of frames, where you were with your process, you would then go back to work and stay as late as, 2 or 3 in the morning, or as early, leave as early as like 9 or 10 at night. On average, you'd put in on a day between 12 and 16 hours. And then after a few days back to back like that, we would go out, like the group of us would go from one place to another. We would explore areas outside of Gdansk. We would go to the beach, maybe go out dancing, go to the bar and have a drink, or go home and just go to sleep and get ready for the next day. The days that you produced more frames, it would be very tempting to stay longer because you were on a roll.
Yeah.
Whereas the days that you were working on mixing the palette, I would want to go home early that day because you'll mix like a ton of the color, like maybe up to like a cup of one of the colors for your palettes. And then you'd have to make sure that that color is accurate. And once it's accurate, then you make more of it. But as you're making more of it, the color fluctuates just a little bit. So you have to make sure that you stay on task and constantly checking it. And like I was saying before, I had 2 main palettes that I managed, and on each palette had anywhere from 1.5 dozen to a couple dozen. It changed of colors to manage. So you imagine lots of colors to mix. So those days were more frustrating than the days where you were just working on frames and making sure the frames passed approval and then working on the next frame. That was a typical, routine.
Yeah.
I drank lots of coffee. There were tons of cafes around the area. And then where I was staying in the old downtown scene of Gdansk, there was a really nice place called Cafe Emporium that I used to frequent before and after work. Unless I got out really late in the day. But if I got out before midnight, they were always open.
They weren't?
They were.
Oh, they were?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's great. I then asked Kat if she has ever worked in a similar fashion, such as from reference material, photograph, or animation, prior to working on this film.
I have worked from reference material a lot in my work. I worked with a lot of Photoshop, a lot of photography. I didn't have a hard time gaining access to live models at school, but outside of school, I'd have a harder time accessing live models for a number of reasons. One, I wouldn't be able to afford to pay them. That's the main reason. And 2, just not having a good space to work with a live model. So I worked with a lot of reference imagery, and that was probably one of the pieces of the puzzle that transitioned into me working with painted animation later on.
Next, Kat describes how working on Loving Vincent has changed her as an artist.
I paint a lot thicker now
Yeah.
than I did before, and that's not intentional. I mean, it just, I pick up a lot more paint on my brushes now. I lay more paint on the canvas or board. I started working with boards more. I was visiting my best friend in Minneapolis, Minnesota, earlier this summer, and she finally got me to try working oil on panel. I've always been a canvas painter.
Yeah.
And now that I pick up a lot more paint on my brushes, it's a lot easier to lay down more paint on whatever support that I'm using. So that changed the consistency. I'm trying to wean it back down because I miss the thin glazes, but I'm kind of I'm not like impasto. I'm not like, there was one professor at UMass that I worked with, and I saw some of his paintings, Anthony Fisher, and he just cakes on tons and tons of paint on his paintings. So I'm not quite, that much of that kind of impasto painter, but I definitely pick up a lot more paint than what I used to. And then in other ways, my work has always combined a lot of different materials, and then also different disciplines. Yeah. And so I was talking earlier about it. It's like an omelet, being like an omelet artist, like taking something, in this case it was painting and animation, and then making an omelet out of those two. I know a similar word, I think hybrid artist, has been thrown around here and there, but I continue to enjoy mixing different mediums and approaches together depending on what the idea of the project is for. So I loved that it was reinforced working on this film. This was the first large production I'd ever worked on too, so it kind of got my appetite a little wet for wanting to work on more production pieces. Yeah. I don't know if I'd want to be an animator or a storyboard artist, or if I'd want to help with the editing, or like there's a lot of different hats that I could wear in those processes, but it just makes me want to keep playing with different mediums together. Yeah, depending on what the project would be.
Do you now have a greater appreciation for Van Gogh's work?
Absolutely. Yes. The consistency that he worked at, I think he was a bit of a plane painter, not plain like boring plane, but like literally he saw the planes of things. Like, think of planes of a cube, the 6 sides, and it's turned at different angles, at different perspectives. Like he didn't have, his brushstrokes were pretty consistent, but looking at how they lined up or contradicted each other in angles, they were very sensitive to the direction of the form that they were representing. So he was a very sculptural painter, I feel like, after working on the film. And then his drawings, he was a great draftsman. He was really good at...
I agree.
Yeah. His drawings showed that he was really good at rendering volume. He was very sensitive to light, but the way that his... the consistency of the way that he painted, he was really good at recognizing those planar structures. So, yes, absolutely.
Now I think you mentioned earlier, but the character in the film that you worked on mostly, or
Dr. Gachet, yes,
Dr. Gachet,
Jerome Flynn.
Jerome Flynn.
Yes, he was, I think, a mercenary in the Game of Thrones show. I forget which seasons and episodes he showed up in the most, but yes, Jerome. He was the guy that I animated. I saw him and briefly got to meet him during the premiere, which happened this year in France. But he was there at the premiere with Dorota and Hugh and Sean.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
So, back to the film and Van Gogh a little bit. And,
okay.
Are there things to learn about Van Gogh that can be found in the film? Like anything new or...
I don't want to give the film away, but there's a different twist in how he ended up where he was in his final days, in his final, the last chapter. And it's intriguing. It is very informing, and I don't want to give it away.
And to close, Kat shares her thoughts on going for it in regards to artistic opportunities.
I think that this would be more either the teacher in me or the student, I don't know, coming out, but going back to what you were saying earlier about how did I get to work on this show, it was a shot in the dark. Like, I knew I wanted to work on it, and there was something in me that just felt like I needed to work on this film. It lined up with everything that I was doing at my studio at the time, as far as forcing two very diverse mediums to talk with each other. But once I threw in my application, I don't know, there was just this shot in the dark chance that, I would have never gotten it if I hadn't tried. So
Yeah.
I think one of the best things I learned about this film was that, and I'd say this to students and to fellow artists who maybe aren't as well practiced in mediums that we're really excited about, but you just don't know what you're capable of until you just try it. Because I wasn't trained in animation. I was all self-taught with animation. But with practice, I developed a really good understanding of, the basic principles of animation. And they're very close. They go hand in hand with design, rendering. They just have that extra 4D element to it. But the point I was trying to make is you don't know until you jump in and you try. And that was probably the best thing I took away from working on this film, and all the reward that came from, the people I met, the thing that I got to be a part of, the things I learned on set, working with a team, getting something much bigger than myself, leading towards that being accomplished. Like, I just jumped in, and it was scary, and I'm really glad that I did it.
Yeah.
And I would totally do it again in hindsight. I would do it to work with an even bigger project. I grew so much, and I try to tell my students all the time that what we learn in school, the techniques, the design, the history, aesthetic, popular culture, trend, that's great. But if you just put your own spin on it and you just keep experimenting, learn that craftsmanship of the medium that you want to work in, and then just put yourself out there, these little opportunities show up in the weirdest ways. I learned about this watching a small clip that flew by my Facebook feed, and I was like, what is that? I'm going to go investigate that. Oh, there's an email, there's a link. I'm going to find out who these people are, what's going on. I'm going to knock on their door. I'm going to bang on their door. Hey, who are you? I want to work on this. That was probably the biggest thing that led to me getting this opportunity. Yeah. So I just encourage other artists, young artists, students to have that continue that same drive. It's obsessive. It's a little maniacal. It's a little crazy sometimes, thinking outside of your own box, because we have boxes that we put around ourselves all the time, and moving beyond that, because you just never know until, like the cliche says, you never know until you try. And I'm really glad I tried with this.
Many thanks to Kat Knutsen for taking the time to share what it was like to work on Loving Vincent. For more on the film, please visit lovingvincent.com. Loving Vincent is set for release in New York City on September 22nd, 2017, in Los Angeles on September 29th, and all over the U.S. shortly thereafter. All music in this episode was composed, recorded, and performed by Kat Knutsen herself. So thanks for listening. Ahtcast home is ahtcast.com. Thanks again.